Right, morning, welcome everybody. Monday morning, we're talking about bias. What is bias? Are we biased? Where does bias come from? I don't know. It's an interesting subject. I was doing a little bit of my research for a change. It. I know. I hope I haven't stolen your thunder there, but yeah, apparently there are 10 different common psychological biases. Uh, I found that quite interesting. So it's quite a well researched and identified subject. So there's the confirmation bias, the hindsight bias, the anchoring bias, the misinformation effect, the actor observer bias, the false consensus effect, the halo effect, the self serving bias, the availability heuristic, and the optimism bias. There you go. So those are all the biases that you can have. So no, Rob, you don't like that. Okay, well I better get across to you
No,
first, and you shaking your head.
no, there are somewhere like 160 biases.
Okay,
So
there you
those
go.
may be the macro biases, but below that, there are many, many, many others. I can't remember the name of the book. I lent it out to a friend, but I will get the name of the book and post it so that you guys can at least have a look at the number of biases. But I guess it's one of those things that it's a buzzword today, not a buzzword, but it's very, very popular because it affects all our behaviors. And it's a case of, do we understand, A, that we have biases? What are those biases? And understanding what those biases are, we know how it's likely to affect our behavior. And if necessary, can adjust or amend or hone those biases or the reaction to those biases, some of which we can do very little about. Sorry for interrupting.
No, no, not at all. No, that's great. Yeah, look, you're quite correct. I mean, that list I got is list of common cognitive biases, not all of them. So that is 10 of the common ones. But yeah, so why not carry on, Rob? So what do you what do you do when you come across a bias? You know, someone who is heavily biased, or you believe they're heavily biased. They may not believe they're heavily biased in a specific direction. How does one deal with it?
I have a story about my brother was actually in the army and got posted down to Youngstown, and it was artillery. And his platoon, he was a loot, and his platoon or whatever was actually made up of quite a variety of different people, but majority of them were very Afrikaans and from a religious background. Um, he's quite a not argumentative, but he likes to discuss matters stuff. So he would argue with them about the faith that they had and originally where did faith come from, etc. And they just turned off completely. They closed. They walked away. They didn't want to hear. It was so entrenched in case of that's their life. That's what's right. Don't shake my tree. They just weren't prepared to listen. So, in cases like that, there's not much you can do when those biases are so deeply entrenched and people won't allow them to be threatened in any way.
Yeah, yeah, it is interesting how people will just shut down if you go at something which, as you say, is so deeply entrenched, they just can't accept a different viewpoint and are not prepared to discuss it. And I don't think we've got anybody like that in this group, do we, Trevor? Let's get across to Trevor and see what he thinks about bias. Okay, he's making all sorts of excuses. He's obviously biased. He doesn't want to talk to us. So, Tabisa, let's go to the philosopher in the group and find out if it's all true or if it's just a myth.
All right. Earlier in the year, I was reading a book called Thinking Fast and Slow, and the book covers cognitive operations of the mind, and of course the biases in the mind. It explained that the mind actually operates on two systems. And we will call these systems System 1 and System 2, you know. System 1 is free flowing and easy. It draws data from working memory and associations in the mind, you know. It provides instant and automatic responses for your mind, and it is part of the brain that is responsible for intuition and creativity, you know. And system two is more delayed and in its response, rather. It is reflective and requires effort, you know. It is analytical and forces you to actually think about things, you know, thoroughly and deeply. This, of course, is the thinking brain, you know. And the book thoroughly explores these two systems, and they actually highlight the biases and how your mind actually perceives reality, you know. Um, the book also explores the term priming, you know. It is a sort of programming in the external world that actually guides the individual on making decisions, you know. It is the notion that we are our environment and that it dictates our behavior consciously or unconsciously, you know. For example, you know, words and advertisements, for example, have this tendency to actually make us and do things in a certain way. They make us act in a certain way, you know. They prime us by their use of words and imagery, you know, and they can actually affect how we perceive reality and how we go about doing things in the world, you know. The priming affects system 1 because it just happens to you, you know, it is automatic. Um, the book also explores biases such as the halo effect, of course, which is like you loving someone you know nothing about. You just met the person and you just like the person, you know, and you like that person because of repressed elements in your psyche, you know, or things that you deem um, familiar based on your unconscious mind or subconscious mind, you know. The book also covers biases like the confirmation bias, hindsight bias, the endowment effect, the disposition effect, the anchoring effect, and plenty more, you know. The book also makes the case that, you know, just about everything in the world is random, you know, and we're not really in control of everything, of anything, you know, and the mind actually just makes up everything, you know. So that's the book. I thought that it was a great book, you know, and I actually learned a lot of things regarding biases, you know. Um, if you know your biases, I think that you can actually channel people into making them do what you want. You actually spoke about, you know, changing people's mind. But I think that if you can understand biases, you know, I think that you have a better chance of doing that, you know, because biases are a way we use biases to navigate the world, you know, and to actually make sense of the world, you know. We think that we are in control when we are not, when things outside of us are actually priming us. So what I learned from the book is that nothing is what it is, you know. Um, Everything's just the way it is, you know. So I think I'll just leave it there. Thank you, Ivan.
Great, thanks, Teresa. It sounds like you and Rob are reading the same kind of book. So if you guys do know what those titles and authors are, just pop them in the chat. That would be interesting to get a look at those. So Jasper, you're not biased at all, are you?
Morning. No, not at all. I feel like a young, uneducated student sitting at the feet of professors here today, with them quoting so liberally from books, and even yourself, Ivan. So I think what I must do is almost do a flip and just bring it to a topic that I can at least make some comment on. But I want to latch on to a bit of what Tabiso said. And I ask myself, purely from when you experiment, it's very important to try and be as unbiased as possible so that you, what you observe is then true observations. But then we also know the story of, even at the quantum level, that the bias plays a huge role. So when they started to split the particles and expected a certain thing, then the particles did exactly as what they expected, and other people who tried to repeat the experiment who expect something else got that other results. So I think in time to come, and I mean, this is the bias has influenced particles. So there's a dimension, a spiritual dimension, that we are actually not aware of how powerful that dimension is. But I don't want to go down that road because, you know, then we really don't, apart from our gut feel about things, we don't know what to talk about. So I'm asking myself, yes, we certainly have bias. And that story of Rob with people have entrenched, call it beliefs. Now, is that wrong or good? And I think the entrenched beliefs, or the, call it the biases of our lives, is prevalent in society, that we see, that is manifested every day around us in the news and media. And I think it was there, whether you then born of whatever race and of whatever religion, and of whatever gender, it was almost to protect you and educate you as to what is your role in society as a man or as a woman, or as you know, your race, or in our religion, this is what we believe. And so while you go through that process, you are not aware of how strong it becomes entrenched. And then later on, we have a choice to decide, yes, I carry on with this belief, or I go against this belief. But most people carry on with the belief. But I think in essence, it's good. Biased is good. I want to make a case for that because it protects us in terms of living. It makes living simple. We don't have to make too hard decisions. It also almost put us on autopilot mode. So your subconscious just takes over, and whatever inputs and you get, signals you get during the day, it quickly filters it through your bias. And if it agrees with your bias, then you accept it. If it doesn't agree with your bias, you just reject it. You don't debate it. You don't argue with it. But it's almost to just make life simple so that you can cope with all the inputs that you get on a daily basis. The question then is, what if that filters that you have built up is actually not serving you? And I'm thinking of a large population of, a large part of our population who have become so entrenched in their, call it hatred for what was wrong in the past in terms of the apartheid system, that they keep on deciding when it comes to election time for a grouping that just hammers on that old thing that's emotionally so entrenched. But they give those people power, and you sit with almost a mafia who control the country. And everybody knows consciously that, hey, things are not right. But then when you get the chance to vote right, you don't vote right because you are biased, you are programmed incorrectly. The same with what are you capable of? I mean, Tobiso is for me a great example of a guy who just refused to accept any labels put on him. And maybe on a daily basis, he even take off his own label and put a new label on him if he likes it. But I mean, that's the sort of quality that one needs in a society to say, listen, anything is possible. We are surrounded by all the books and all the things. So I think I'm trying to make a case for bias is entrenched. It's there to make living simple. But the question is it serving us or is it hampering us? And where it then hampers us, we then have to say, all right, how do I now change the bias? Change.
Good, thanks Jasper. Right, Lee, so can you change Jasper's bias? I mean, it came out so clearly in his little...
Yeah, so I've been working with Paul, who many of you met on Wisdom's Chats, and she runs a market research company. And the market research he's doing is for big corporates, and the research they're doing is to deliberately understand their own biases, that they come from a perspective, and unless they investigate what the consumer is actually doing, is really experiencing in their environment. So the market research that Mpho does is qualitative research. So it's not so much about ticking boxes and getting statistics, while that may be important. It's more about being in the experience and sharing in the stories and environment of the people that they are wanting to sell things to, whatever you want to think about that. But it's interesting that they have this understanding that unless they get to know their consumer, they will sell according to their own biases. And there was a classic example of and when they're kind of doing interviews and they're listening to stories and so on, and the client is there with them. On this one particular occasion, they showed a video of a domestic worker who was buying something online, and then it was some item of clothing, and then she put the clothing on and she looked $1 million and was walking down the road, feeling fabulous and looking amazing. And the client couldn't compute that this was their target market, that a domestic worker would have the savvy to order online and have this a great experience of feeling really wonderful about how she looked, and it was because they came with a preconceived idea of what a domestic worker living in a shack, what their life was about. And that's so those biases come in all shapes and sizes. It doesn't, they're with us all the time, as Thabiso was saying. And we need, even when evidence is put in front of us of something that's different, we have to, we get challenged. And I want to pick up on what Thabiso was saying about the halo effect, because and it was interesting, I was thinking about this example coming in. I listened to an interview of a South African musician, poet on the radio. His name, very, very well known. He's an internationally renowned DJ. Thabiso, you'll know him. I don't know if anybody else will, and that's Black Coffee. So I was listening to him and I just was in awe of this man's talent, his humanity, his language. He was just, I thought, this is a ambassador for South Africa, and an incredibly amazing man. And the halo effect was there. Anything I ever thought about music or South Africa, it was Black Coffee. I mean, my kids actually got frustrated with me because I was such a fan. And then I follow him on Twitter. And he recently, about maybe a year ago, more recently, I don't know, he got divorced. Okay. And then I saw him post something on Twitter about his wife. And it was so derogatory and so out of place. It made me, the whole little halo that I had built around this man, it was so inappropriate. I thought, no, it doesn't, and it suddenly he became human, right? He became human. And so there's that aspect of being faced with your bias, which might be positive or negative, and how it somehow needs to balance out. the last thing I want to say about bias, and because I was actually having this conversation with my daughter, we did a big walk around Emmarentia, and she was saying, well, we were sort of discussing whether you confront people about their biases. So my dad was a very typical Zimbabwean white male, and his language was very racist. And my daughter would confront him, and she would say, "Granddad, that's not acceptable. You can't say that. That is not appropriate." And it was something that I never felt I could do, because I always felt I would get resistance, and that he would just push back at me, and here was this young girl just saying, "No, you can't do it." And you know what? He changed. He changed his language. He changed. And when you change your language, as Tabisa said, when you change your language, you change your thinking. And so that was an interesting perspective of, when do you confront? When do you hold back? When do you say, no, you've got to actually think differently about this? So yeah, that's me on bias.
Great, thanks, Lee. So, Edward, set us all right. Change our biases. Tell us where we're wrong.
I'm absolutely crushed because I don't think Lee follows me on Twitter. I didn't even know Lee was on Twitter, so yeah, I'm crushed. I've decided to concentrate on gender bias. And the reason for that was because when I spoke on, I think it was Friday, about more women dying in car crashes because the safety measures are tested on dummies, I think one or two people looked skeptical. So I did some research, and I actually found the source of the statistics I was using. And it is 47%. Women have got a 47% more chance of being injured in a car accident when they're driving than a man, because of the safety features in the car. And it comes from a study by the University of Virginia's Center for Applied Biomechanics. And if you stop and think about it, it kind of makes sense, because women are generally shorter than men. So they sit closer to the steering wheel. And they also tend to sit more upright. Whereas a man sits further away, and he's more laid back, not in the terms of relaxed, but his positioning in the seat. And they only used to use male-sized test dummies. And when I looked back and thought about, Volvo used to run a series of adverts to show how good their cars were in a crash, and they showed the car crashing with dummies. And when I looked back at those adverts, I remember, if there was a female dummy, it was in the passenger seat, which was probably quite appropriate 30 years ago, because when I used to go on holiday and drive down to Cornwall and look in the other cars, all the other cars with families in, it was the man driving. And of course, I always thought that was counterintuitive, because women are useless at reading maps, apparently. So the man should have been in the passenger seat using his better map reading skills to navigate. But anyhow, there you go. And in 2011, in America, they changed the legislation around car safety announcements. And they had to then do all the safety tests with male and female typical dummies. And cars suddenly went from having a 5-star rating for safety to having, well, if you take one example, the Toyota Sienna, very popular model in the States. In 2010, it had a 5-star crash safety rating. The following year, when they had to use the new tests, they fell to only a 2-star rating. So that bias that it's always the man that drives is really, really dangerous. And I think we can talk about biases too lightly because they have massive effects. And when I was doing my research, I found this fascinating article in the Guardian newspaper, which I'll put in the chat. And it highlighted some of the effects of this. And back in the 1960s, they decided to, I see that Ivan's putting loads of stuff in the chat. I don't know whether it's for or against, but I'll have a look later. In the 1960s, they decided on what was a good office temperature to have. And they settled on this office temperature, and it was based on the resting metabolic rate of a man. Now, women have different metabolic rates. In the outdoor industry, we're much more enlightened, because in the outdoor industry, we know that a woman needs a warmer sleeping bag than a man because of different body temperatures. But offices were based on male which was quite interesting. And that male assumption pervades everywhere. When Siri was first launched, way back in 2000 and maybe early 2010s, it could tell you in New York where you could buy Viagra, but it couldn't tell you where you could get an abortion. There's lots more examples like that, but Viagra is really interesting because Viagra was originally produced by Pfizer to treat chest pain, but it didn't work. And they abandoned the research, but someone noticed that one of the side effects reported was unwanted erections. So they then researched it and produced Viagra to cope with ED or ED, erectile dysfunction. I hate it when I see adverts saying get rid of ED. I get worried. Anyhow, but the other interesting thing about that research was that one of the other side effects was that women reported less period pain. That was never followed up because the researchers were men. And we don't talk about periods. It's not something that's good to talk about. We get really uncomfortable when we mention that sort of stuff. So let's talk about bricks. Bricks are nice and comfortable, aren't they? There's nothing controversial about a brick. You know, the things you build houses with. I don't know whether you've ever wondered why a brick is the size it is. In the UK, a brick is 3 5/8 inches by 2 1/4 inches by 8 inches. And I don't know what that is in metric. And I'm not sure whether in South Africa they use standard size bricks, but the UK brick is a certain size. It's always the same size. Why is it that size? Because it's the largest it can be to comfortably fit in a male hand. Now, that didn't matter at all when builders used to work with their shirts off and wolf whistle at passing women when they're on the scaffolding. But now women are getting into construction. That's a problem. And this carries over into the iPhone. Some of the bigger phones with the bigger screens, a man can operate it one-handedly quite easily. A woman finds it difficult. But all the guys that invent phones think that men drive phone sales. They don't, but they think that. And then I think in 2014, we were still going down this route. Actually, perhaps I'll change it. No, I won't. Yes, I will. Bricks just reminded me of triathlons. You might wonder why bricks remind me of triathlons. If you're into sports, you'll know that there are things called brick sessions, which are a training session where you do one discipline and then you do the next discipline. So a brick session might be a hard bicycle ride followed by a hard run. That's a brick session. Now, I know that because I'm a trained triathlon coach. And I've also taken running courses. And on all my courses, I was told that it's important to be athlete-centered. And that's the most important thing about being a coach. You have to be athlete-centered. Now, I hope you're all sitting down because this bit is really shocking. Women enter triathlons and women run. Yeah. Now, the other thing I'd found out about women is that women have a hormone cycle. All women have it. Now, when I was dealing with these particular individuals, it's much better to do some of the hard speed sessions at certain points in the cycle. And it's better to do the easier sessions at other points. Now, yet not once in all my athlete-centered training was that ever mentioned. It was never mentioned once in all my training. And it's because the coaches were men, the coaches were the national bodies, the England Athletics and the British Triathlon Association, male dominated. Yet 50% of all my clients had a different training regime to the one I was being taught, and I was supposed to be athlete-centered. And that carries on because when Apple brought out their fantastic, wonderful health app, guess what? It could tell you what your heart rate was. It could tell you what your step rate was. It could tell you what your blood pressure was. It could tell you how much, and I can never say this word, molybdenum you had in your food intake, how much copper you had in your food intake. It didn't have a period tracker. So, and there's an interesting paper I came across, I haven't had time to fully research it, by the European Union about the advantages of gender innovation. I'll put the link in the chat. So the whole point of focusing on the gender, and it shocked me how much it is ingrained from bricks to iPhones, to temperature, to crash dummies, to all sorts. It's getting better, but not fast enough. But the whole point is that if we can be that biased, just think of how all this other subtle stuff is coming along. And yes, Jasper's right. Bias is useful depending on which group you're in. Some people suffer more than most from bias. It tends to be, quite pervasive, and we don't notice it because I had never thought about why a brick was the size a brick was. So there you go. That's my take on bias, and I'll put the link to that article and the link to the paper in the chat.
Great stuff. Thank you, Dr. Edie. I think enough said, period. Right. I think we are past the bottom of the hour, and you can clearly see that Ed is very passionate about that particular subject. I'm not too sure which part of the subject, but he's very passionate about it. But
I'm passionate about women. Yeah,
I can see that. I can see that, Ed. Yeah, it must come from your days in the sock industry. But we won't go down that route. All right, good. Thanks everyone. I think we're going to leave it there. We are past what tomorrow is Personal Mastery Day on Wisdom. So Lee, what are we discussing on Personal Mastery tomorrow?
We're talking about conforming or not conforming, which is the pathway to success. All
right, and Ed's just shown us all about that. So we are definitely not conforming to some of the standard biases around. And then Wednesday we are doing what? So we have a topic for Wednesday. Anybody want to pop a topic in for Wednesday?
Wednesday will be my last day for a week because I'm going wild camping on Dartmoor. So I won't choose a subject for Wednesday because
I'm happy for us to maybe pick something up tomorrow.
Okay.
and we can go from there if that's okay, unless somebody's got something in mind.
All right. No, I think that's good. So all good. Very jealous, Ed. Not fair. But we'll see you on Wednesday before you get off. But other than that, folks, have a great day further. And we look forward to seeing you tomorrow morning. Join us if you can. Go well. Cheers.